and good evening. I'm Melisa Idris. Welcome to Consider This. This is the show where we want you to consider and then reconsider what you know of the news of the day. I'm here today at the International Social Wellbeing Conference here in Renaissance Hotel KL, and I'm joined by one of the speakers at the event today, Professor Robert Reich, who is a Chancellor's Professor of Public Policy at the University of California, Berkeley. He's a co-creator of the award-winning documentary film Inequality for All and the co-founder of Inequality Media. Now, he has served in 3 U.S. administrations, including as Secretary of Labor for the Clinton administration, for which Time magazine named him one of the 10 most effective cabinet secretaries of the 20th century. So I'm so glad he said yes to this interview. Secretary Reich, thank you so much for being on the show with me today. I want to begin our conversation maybe by referencing your latest book, The System, Who Rigged It and How to Fix It, in which you argue that power and wealth in the U.S. are concentrated in the hands of the few. And I think that feels somewhat similar to how Malaysians view our economic and political links here. So I'm wondering if you could begin by talking a little bit about how this concentration of power and wealth may undermine democratic principles and whether you see parallels in other countries.
The concentration of power and wealth clearly does undermine democracy, because if wealth is concentrated in the hands of a few, that wealth can easily be put into politics through everything from political campaign contributions to public relations to lawsuits. There is an infinite way great wealth can be used. One of our, in the United States, great jurists, Louis Brandeis, said in the 1920s, America faces a choice. We can have great wealth in the hands of a few, or we can have a democracy, but we can't have both. Now, he was speaking at the end of the first Gilded Age, as it was called, when wealth was very highly concentrated. America is now in the second Gilded Age. We have as much wealth concentration as we had then, and indeed, the world, the globe, is now witnessing more wealth concentration than ever before.
How did that happen? How did so much economic gain get concentrated in the hands of so few?
Part of it has to do with the financialization of the global economy. When you look at financial centers like Wall Street or London or various other places around the world, you see that basically a very few number of people are in charge of allocating capital around the world. And as they allocate huge amounts of capital, they take a little bit of it. But as they take a little bit of it, the amounts that they are pushing around the globe are so great that they actually end up wealthier, far wealthier than before. There is also, secondly, the problem of corruption. And I hate to even bring it up, but we have to be realistic. It is a problem in all of our countries, and great wealth does generate corruption. Buying politicians off is a form of corruption. It is bribery.
Talk to me a little bit about the U.S. context of money in politics.
Big money is dominating American politics more and more and more. It would be one thing if it was just corporate money and very wealthy people, but it is really big money that is coming in from the entire world. Wow. It would be less of a problem if you had, for example, as we used to have, labor organizations that were also quite powerful and had a lot of money to contribute to candidates. But we don't have that kind of power that is balancing the power of big corporations any longer.
One of the things that has really struck me, one of the things that you've said that's really struck me, and I hadn't considered this before, was you said power is a zero-sum game. And I hadn't thought about it in that way, that to gain more power, someone has to lose that power. How are you seeing that pan out in today's capitalist political structures?
Well, unfortunately, it means that as power is concentrated in fewer and fewer hands, more and more people don't have it. That generates widespread distrust and suspicion, paranoia. It is, in those circumstances, relatively easy for demagogues to come along and say, well, here's what's really going on, and trust me, because I have the truth, when it's not the truth at all. We see in the United States, and I don't want to talk about Donald Trump.
It's really hard not to.
For example, it's hard not to. But we do see the rise of politicians who lie brazenly. And I think that the public is so confused and so distrustful that some people believe those lies.
When we think about how it affects democracy, how what you've described is concentration of power and wealth in the hands of a few, an oligarchy, if we can describe it as such, and how that impacts democracy when the majority feel that they are without agency, that they are without power, or are at a deficit. How do we correct that? Are there ways in which an oligarchy can be redistributed or dismantled?
Well, we saw an example in the late 1920s and 1930s, at least in the United States, and also to some extent elsewhere around the world, where oligarchies suffered and lost their wealth because of the Great Depression. Now, can't be the answer, because we don't want
wait for a Great Depression.
And we don't want a Great Depression. It hurt too many people. Also, oligarchies have been overthrown through world wars. We don't want a world war. The question is, can the majority of people in a society create a fair society, have higher taxes on the very wealthy, have broad-based subsidies that ensure that everybody has a decent life? Can we do that without a revolution? I think we can, but the jury is out.
Do you see that happening in the U.S.? Is there public will and desire for a fairer, more equal society to bring down or to dissipate the concentration of wealth and power at the hands of the few?
There certainly is.
Okay.
When the question is asked, do you want to get big money out of politics? Almost everybody says yes. When the question is asked, do we want a fairer tax system? Should the very wealthy be paying at least the same percentage of their income as everyone else? That's broadly based. Everybody says yes. But to get it done requires that you somehow get involved in and stop the vicious cycle of wealth and power. That's the chicken and egg problem.
Who's going to be that disruptor? What is going to be that disruptor?
Well, it's a very good question. I spend a lot of time worrying about it, because in my lifetime, for example, in the 30 years after World War II, we had a very large and growing middle class in the United States, which stabilized the country. It provided the basis of not only prosperity, but democracy. But over the last 40 years, we've gone in the other direction. The middle class is shrinking. The wealthy are more wealthy. People who are working class and poor are getting the shorter end of the stick, as it were. And that is destabilizing society. So what's the answer? What kind of social chaos do we have to go through? And I hope we don't. But when I saw the riot on January 6th, 2021 in Washington, in the Capitol, I said, a little piece of my brain went off and said, well, this is the beginning of a revolution, not a good one.
Oh dear.
You know, this is a demagogic revolution. This is a dangerous revolution. But at least it may propel the nation to get our democracy back.
Has it?
Oh, no, it hasn't
Okay.
yet. No, at least it may.
Okay.
I mean, we're going through a very, very dangerous time.
So could you maybe describe in your own words to a Malaysian audience how you see America today? I mean, we're looking at it from a perspective outside of America, and there's this kind of American hegemony, an American narrative that the U.S. is still the great global superpower. How do Americans feel today about the state of their nation?
Well, I cannot speak, obviously, for all Americans. I can tell you on the basis of surveys, polls, all sorts of research that's being done, and my own free-floating focus group, that Americans are very distressed. Although Joe Biden, I think, is an extremely good president, and although the economy is doing much better, people are angry at each other. The country is very divided. I think what we've been through with Mr. Trump has been extremely difficult for many people. And our democracy hangs in the balance. I'm quite serious about that. We are the richest country in the history of the world. We should be able to do whatever we want for our people. And yet, we seem unable to.
Right. And I'm not going to ask you to bring out your crystal ball because I'm not sure whether you packed it with you.
Oh, I have it right here.
Oh, wonderful.
No.
So what do you think is going to happen from now until November? What are the things that we should be, as outside observers, be paying attention to in the way American society responds to the lead-up of the elections?
Well, I think the question that I keep asking myself is this. Will the most powerful economy and the most powerful nation in the world begin to turn to the questions that the rest of the world really needs world leadership on? Climate change, for example, nuclear proliferation and the making sure nuclear war does not break out anywhere, making sure that global poverty is reduced, making sure that global health is improved. These are all things that the world's richest and biggest and most powerful economy ought to be addressing.
Do you think there is a kind of vacuum in terms of global leadership? Has the U.S. kind of abdicated that role to others?
Well, I think that the United States could do much more, let's put it that way. But the United States is now so much, so divided and so worried about itself in a way that we are not exerting the kind of global leadership we're capable of, and that the world needs at a time like this.
I should probably get to the subtitle of your book, which is The System, Who Rigged It, How to Fix It. So in summary, for the last bit, how to fix it, is there a silver bullet solution that you could give us of how to fix a system that has been rigged?
No, there's no silver bullet. But it does require a degree of public understanding of the nature of the problem. People need to understand that we have got to, and this is true of every society, develop countervailing sources of power so people don't have to be so dependent on a shrinking and ever more powerful group of wealthy people at the top. We've got to make democracy work. We all have a stake in that. And that includes getting rid of corruption and the so-called leakage from this tax system, making sure that everyone has an equal opportunity to get ahead. And one thing that I am so impressed with here in Malaysia, you have a society that is multicultural, multi-ethnic, multi-religious. You have, in some ways, the entire world represented here. And you are working hard on these issues. People take these issues very seriously.
So making people understand the issues at hand, is that why you founded Inequality Media? Is that why you've done a lot of the documentary film, Inequality for All? Do you feel the need to influence public perception away from just kind of mainstream media narratives?
Well, if the mainstream media narratives were accurate, I wouldn't feel any compulsion.
Are they not accurate?
They're not completely accurate, no. I think that they don't talk about power, the issues we are now talking about. That's something that everyone runs under the table. If they have any power, they don't want to talk about it.
Don't address it.
They don't want to address it.
Don't look at it right in the eyes.
Yes, exactly. I believe in education. I have spent over 40 years as a professor. I've written a lot of books. I've done documentaries, all with the goal of helping people understand what is true about the system we live in and what's the nature of our obligations to one another as members of the same society. This is the fundamental moral question that we all need to engage in. Not everybody will come up with the same answer, but we at least need to understand that that is the question that should be addressed.
I'm speaking to Robert Reich, former U.S. Secretary of Labor, the author of The System, Who Rigged It and How We Fix It. He's one of the speakers here at the International Social Wellbeing Conference. And I want to talk a little bit about the topic, the theme of the conference today, which is aging and longevity and how to have a good retirement. How do you view this transition, this part? Do you consider yourself retired, or are you still working? How do you view it?
My wife would say I'm never going to retire. She's with me here, and she's saying we work all the time. I don't consider it work.
Okay.
To me, retirement is about doing more of what you love and less of what you don't. That's it. And because I've pretty much been lucky enough to do most of what I want all the time, retirement doesn't really mean very much to me. But what is increasingly meaningful to me is this issue of lifespan and health span, because frankly, I've been studying these questions for many years, but I've never been old before, and suddenly they're very dramatic and real. You know, you get to be in your late 70s or 80s, and you begin to say, wait a minute, I'm going to die eventually, and there are illnesses, and my friends are getting sick, and this is actually real. This is not some abstraction. And so I'm looking at it slightly differently.
How do you see it in the context of a capitalist society that doesn't value an aging population, that views the elderly as a liability, as dependents, as unproductive? How do we reconcile, especially in Malaysia, some track to becoming an aging population, an aging country, in a capitalist world? How does that jive?
It's a very good question, a very hard question to answer, because most countries through the millennia have honored their elderly. And usually the responsibility of caring for the elderly fell on their families, their children, unfortunately too often the daughters. But now capitalism has ripped families apart and has also put a premium on how much somebody can earn. So your question, how in global capitalism do you continue to honor and value older people who are no longer productive, is a very complicated question. Now, the way most societies are now dealing with it is, well, you have to save more. You've got to come up with various schemes for saving while you're young so that you, when you're old, you have enough money to live on. That's part of the answer, but that can't be the whole answer. There's got to be much more of a question addressed to families and communities. What are you doing about your members who are aging?
I also wonder how it would affect this kind of intergenerational equity if one generation is significantly wealthier than maybe the younger generation. And we always hear that, you know, the boomer generation has a lot more accumulated wealth. than the majority of, say, the younger millennials or Gen X generation. How do you think about the differences of wealth accumulation amongst the generations and what that means for an aging population, intergenerational equity? What do you think about that?
Well, we are about, in the world, to face the largest intergenerational transfer of wealth in world history.
Wow.
As wealthy boomers, and they're not a huge number, but there are many, begin to die off and leave to their millennial children gigantic fortunes. So 10 or 20 or 30 years from now, we will have a record number of who are now millennials who have never worked in their lives and live extraordinarily wealthy lives.
I wonder what that's like.
Well, we'll find out. We may not know them, but it is a social question because we in our capitalist societies tend to look at people who don't work as sort of lesser people. But suddenly we're going to have millennials who have a lot of money and who will not be working at all. In the United States right now, 60% of all wealth is inherited. Right now, even before the boomers die off in large numbers. So you can imagine how much wealth will be in the hands of people who have never worked a day in their lives in 10, 20, 30 years.
What does that mean if you tie it back to the beginning of our conversation? If economic gains concentrated in the hands of so few, generational wealth concentrated in the hands of few, which translates into political power and policy making and governance power, what would that mean if there has this entire generation who may not have worked for their wealth, but are essentially holders of political office and holders of national power?
It's a very difficult question to answer because we're rushing into this question very, very fast. Now, what we're going to find, and again, I'm just looking at trends now, is that you have many, many young people who have great wealth, who have never worked, but they have to put their money somewhere. Where are they going to put their money? Is it going to be in philanthropic sort of ventures, or are they going to put their money into the stock market or into enterprises? They have never worked. So how do we trust them in terms of being custodians of the entire wealth of society to make the right decisions about where wealth should be put? I think invariably we're going to have to re-examine our tax systems.
Oh, okay. Like a wealth tax.
And look at estate taxes and generational inheritance taxes, because it's just simply not permissible, not fair. It rubs people the wrong way to think of all of these trillions and trillions of dollars shifting from one generation to another.
But that is a bitter pill for any government to swallow in implementing any kind of wealth or inheritance tax, because of course the pushback will be quite severe.
Well, the pushback from the wealthy.
Yes, who has all the power?
Well, that's exactly the irony and the paradox. But it's necessary, and over the next, again, I'm talking about 20 or 30 years, these societies, all of them, the United States, Malaysia, anywhere, will be tested on this very question.
So you've been observing these trends for many, many years, and you've written many books about it, but what keeps you hopeful that America, that countries around the world will continue to survive and thrive and solve these inherent problems?
I'm hopeful, number one, because young people are very committed. One thing that keeps me young and hopeful is teaching. Now, I've retired from teaching, but I still stay in contact with a lot of young people. They are very dedicated to improving society. Now, they may not be doing it with 100% of their time. They can't afford to. But they have social consciences. And this is, I think, perhaps the most important issue of all. Do you have, in the next generation, an understanding and a willingness to improve society?
Secretary Reich, thank you so much for speaking with me. I appreciate your time.
Well, I appreciate it. Thank you.
That's all we have for you on this episode of Consider This. I'm Melisa Idris, signing off for the evening. Thank you so much for watching, and good night.